Well,
Hey everyone, and welcome to our April live event for National Quilter Circle. We're once again joined by Toby Lischko, who's here to answer all of your quilting questions. So thanks for being here, Toby.
well, thank you for having me. I'll try to answer all the questions. Some I might not be able to, but I'll try.
I'm very confident that you'll be able to handle all of our questions. All right, our first one here coming in. Someone says that they have been given lots of large pieces of fabric which have had the selvage cut off. So they want to know, what is the best way to cut strips from these lovely fabrics I simply have to use?
Okay. Well, the best way to do it is you have to figure out which is the grain, right? The straight of grain, and if you pull on the straight of grain, the one that's the selvage edge has the least amount of give. So if you find out what that selvage edge is, you can cut from the selvage edge. You can cut either direction, but you just want to make sure that if you're cutting something that you want along the selvage edge, you just have to give that fabric a good tug. And if it one way it tug, you give a little more give if it's along the other grain. If you tug it along the selvage grain, it just has very little give to it. So that's the best way to figure out where it's at.
Okay, so then once you find which one the selvage is, how do you go about prepping your fabric to cut long strips?
Well, then I would, if I found where the selvage is, I'd fold it in half and make sure that I've folded it nice and flat. And then, so there's no little ridges or lumps in it. And then I would take my ruler and I'd get a nice straight 90-degree angle on one of the sides. And then I'd start cutting from that side.
Perfect. Do you ever, because I know we have an instructor on National Quilter Circle who does this when they are trying to find straight of grain and things like that, do you ever rip your fabric, or do you only always cut your fabric?
I rip my fabric for all my backings because
Okay.
I want the backings to be on the straight of grain, and it's easier to get your backings even on all sides. I don't rip it along the selvage edge, but I rip it along the from selvage to selvage, the width I need for my backings, and then I know they're square.
Is that something that you have done or learned as a long arm quilter? Because I have to say that I've never done that before, but I also send 90% of my quilts to a friend who is a long arm quilter. And so I don't know if she does that or not, but is that sort of where that came from?
I think so. I think it is where it came from, because when you put a fabric on your long arm machine, and if it's not square, one side might be a little looser than the other side when you roll it up. And so then what happens is you don't have a nice flat back. So if you tear it and you know it's square, then it rolls up very nice and flat and works better.
Perfect. All right. Speaking of loading quilts onto a long arm machine, because we've had guests on our live chats before who have done 100% quilting on conventional machines, and so you're one of the first who actually has a long arm and does your quilting that way. So when we've asked previous people how they start quilting, they always say, in the center and work their way out, or something along those lines. Which, I guess, how does that compare to using a long arm?
Well, with the when I was quilting on my regular machine, I'd start in the middle and work out. But with the long arm machine, you don't have to do that, because all your layers are tight and they're together, pinned together or stitched together along the top or the bottom or along the side. Oh, I stitch them along the sides as I quilt them. So it keeps everything nice and flat, and you can start anywhere. But I mean, since it's rolled onto the quilt, you start at the top of the quilt and you work your way down. Now, there are times when I've used one or two different threads, color threads, and then I'll use one color thread, wind it back up, and then I use another color thread. But what I usually do, if I have a big quilt and I have lots of blocks, is I will quilt in the ditch around all my blocks before I do any quilting to stabilize the quilt really nice so that I don't distort any of the blocks. And that works well for me.
So that's where you start in terms of area on your quilt. How do you start in terms of figuring out your design, how you're going to quilt your quilts, what goes well with whatever block or design you have?
That's a tough one for me because I never know what I'm going to do. Usually I don't get the idea of what to quilt until I put it on the machine. And I look at the fabric and I think about, well, this is a floral fabric, so I'm going to put roses on it. Or if it's a loopy fabric, I'm going to put loops on it. So I just call it doodling. and whatever comes to my mind, I just start putting on the quilt. Sometimes now, right now I'm doing a panel quilt and I'm quilting it. And the panel is lavender leaves and butterflies. And so I quilted around the leaves and the butterfly and I outlined them just to accentuate the panel. And then everything else I just kind of quilt. Sometimes I do continuous quilting, which just means you quilt from corner to corner with little curves. It just kind of depends on my mood.
Perfect. Quick question. Huh?
And how much time I have to quilt.
Oh, yes. Perfect. All right. Quick question about panel quilts, because I think the very first time I ever heard the term panel quilt, I thought that only meant that you used, pre-printed fabric panels, but it can also mean that you just piece a panel, right? Like there could be more blocks within a panel rather than just the fabric, right?
Right. A panel quilt, usually when you think of a pre-printed quilt, that's like those baby quilts that you can quilt around the designs. But a panel is what might be 24 by 36. And then I design blocks to go around the panel and then add a border around that. So it usually has blocks and a border around the panel. It just makes it look better than just a panel.
Right.
And the panels aren't big enough to be a quilt anyway.
Right. All right. Our next one here, this kind of goes along with what we're talking about in terms of squaring up fabric, but Hetty wants to know, how do you rip your fabric?
I rip it along. I just cut a slip and I rip it along the straight of grain from selvage to selvage. Some people tear the other way too, along the selvage edge, but I like to leave the selvage on when I'm quilting the backing, for the backing, because it pins to the machine better.
So I guess when I read that question, I was thinking more, it's like, so the important thing is you have to actually do that little snip with your scissors first, right? Otherwise you have to get it started somehow.
Right. You do have to get it started before you can rip it.
Yeah, perfect. All right, next question here. What is the best stabilizer to use on silk material being made into a baby blanket?
Well, I have a friend who uses silk a lot, and she uses this very lightweight, what's it called? Not stabilize. Well,
Like interfacing?
Yeah, interfacing. Really, really lightweight interfacing that she irons onto the silk, because silk, and she doesn't cut silk with a rotary cutter. She tears her silk, because if you tear silk, it's torn along the grain, and it doesn't. When you cut silk, it has these little threads that just fly or flap around,
Mm-hmm.
So she tears the silk. I took a class from her. She tears the silk into strips and sews those strips together. But she says if you cut it, it just makes a mess.
I'm gonna have to try that, because I feel like, yeah, silks, satins, like any of those kind of fabrics usually that make a mess, and they're like staticky too. There's usually a lot of static involved, and then those threads really go everywhere.
But what she does is it's like a quilt as you go, except it's a sew as you go, on the stabilizer. So you have a strip and you sew it to the stabilizer, and then you sew your next strip to the stabilizer. So that way it stabilizes the silk, because it's so hard to sew on if you just do it just the silk alone, because it's so slippery.
Right. Because we're talking about silk, and that's not a standard quilting fabric, have you ever combined multiple types of fabrics or different fabrics within the same quilt? And if so, like, how do you go about doing that?
No, I have never done that.
No.
No, the friend who does silk she's had a customer that gave her all these clothes that were her husband's or her children's, and she's put them in quilts, like a sweater and a sweatshirt and a silk blouse and I don't know how she did it, but it turned out cute. So yeah, I mean, you can do it, but I just work with cotton. I don't work with any other. You can make clothes out of the rayon, but I use cotton in my quilts. Not that you can't use. I mean, some of the fabric companies are selling silk now. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right, next question here. When sewing on the top binding, where would you start sewing? I do have the binding sewn on the back, and now I need to attach it to the top or the front.
Oh, okay. So Well, you can start it anywhere. I mean, if you've already got it sewn on the back, and you're pulling it to the front, there are some feet attachments you can have. My friend told me there's a special foot for her machine, and it has a little edge to it, and it sits right next to the binding, and the stitch you can stitch right on the edge of the binding.
Mhm.
You can start stitching anywhere. I mean, if you don't want that beginning stitch where you have to sew over it at the end to show, then do it towards the bottom or someplace that's inconspicuous. But yeah, there's no special place. Normally when I put my binding on, I start at about a third of the way down on the right side, and then I work my way around the quilt.
Mhm. Do you tend to sew to the back and wrap to the front, or do you sew to the front and wrap to the back?
I usually sew to the front and wrap to the back because I like to do hand binding.
Mhm.
But if I'm in a hurry, I sew to the back, and I'll machine stitch it to the front.
Perfect. I also used to always do that too. Sew to the front, wrap to the back, and then I kind of got a backlog of quilts needing to be hand stitched with the binding on. And then my mom came and visited, and she finished a bunch of them for me. So see, I just have to, hire that work out a little bit. But speaking of the feet you did mention, so I know there is a couple different presser foot attachments that you can use for putting on your binding. One is, like you said, it has that groove, it goes right along for when you're attaching the binding that's already folded in place. And then I just saw this today on Facebook actually, and I have not looked into it as much as I should yet, but it's one that will actually like do the folding and the stitching at the same time. It's like this big contraption, but it looks awesome. So I'm going to have to look into that and see if that actually really does work in terms of.
I have two different machines, and I was looking to see if my machines had that special foot, and I haven't found it yet. But she said it worked perfectly.
Yeah, the one I've seen it on is where you can, buy sort of a combo pack of different presser feet that do, fit several different machines. You just have to check and see if it fits the machine, that works well, or that works the one with you're working on. So I'm going to ask this one now because I know we're going to get this question a couple times because we've seen it on the Facebook page, I've seen it on the website, but we want to know what is going on with our next challenge that is going to be starting soon.
Well, because everybody had so much fun doing that mystery medallion, I decided to design another medallion quilt. But this time it won't be a mystery. So you'll get to see it ahead of time. You'll get to pick your fabrics ahead of time. I've picked 2 different groups of fabric that I'm going to do mine in. I can go get it if you want of them, if you want. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I don't think it's going to have as many flying geese on it as that last one did.
Well, we've got so much practice with those now that everyone should be, so happy that they can do them now. But then there's also going to be an added option with this one, right? We're going to do, again, multiple size options, correct? And then some additional embellishment options.
Yes, and Ashley and I are doing this collaboratively. That's a word, isn't it? And she's doing some applique. So in some of the blocks, she's going to do applique. If you want to exchange the block instead of doing a piece block, you can do an applique in that space. So she's picked out some different spaces on my quilt design, and she's going to put in her own applique. Now, the thing about this quilt too is we're going to use some AccuQuilt dies in it from the 8-inch cube. Mm-hmm. And Ashley's using some dies from applique dies from AccuQuilt. So if you have an AccuQuilt and you have the dies, then you can use those to cut your pieces.
Yeah, and definitely, like I said, not only cut the applique pieces, which is going to make that so much easier, just because they're going to be sort of some fun shapes that you are going to have to use, scissors or something to cut out if you don't have those. But just being able to use the cube for the block too, because it is sort of, standard sizes, right, to make these blocks that are going to finish at the 8-inch. So that's why you can use that 8-inch cube.
Right. There will be some pieces that you have to cut that aren't included in the 8-inch cube, but that gives you a clue that all the blocks are going to be 8 inches.
See, I wasn't going to point that out, but you know, we gotta give them some clues ahead of time. So if you're watching this and you're not familiar with what the challenges are, this is National Quilter Circle puts on a challenge. We're doing them more often now. We're trying to do them every few months or so, and you can sign up. We will be posting links when we can officially sign up for this new one, but you can do it through National Quilter Circle website, through the NQC Quilt Block Challenge Facebook group page, and it's a lot of fun. You can obviously get the pattern. It's a free pattern. And we'll be doing some videos along the way to help out with the instruction. So there'll be lots of learning that you can do along this challenge as well. So with the past challenges that we have done, some of the questions from the very beginning have been, do these fabrics look good together? How do I pick, you know, 7, 8 different fabrics that go good together in a quilt? So how do you do your fabric selection?
Well, I always start with a really a fabric that I really like. It could be a border fabric, could be a big, large print, and then I pick my colors from that. If you look at collections, all the colors are put together for you already. So a lot of times, if you go to a quilt shop and you find a collection you like, then all those fabrics are ready to go. Now, a lot of the quilters that are in our group are scrap quilters, and so you can always use scraps to make quilts. I've saw some of those. I mean, I didn't think even the ice crystals quilt would look neat with scraps, and there were some beautiful scrappy ice quilt quilts.
Absolutely. Do you try to stick to, so say the fabric requirements say there's going to be 8 fabrics. Do you say, okay, of those 8 fabrics, you know, 1 or 2 are going to be prints and the rest should be solids, or can they all be prints? What is like too overwhelming of a color scheme or a fabric collection?
Well, I mean, you have to have a variety of big prints and small prints, and even some tone on tones. A tone on tone just means like it's white on white, or it might have a real light gray on white, or something that's a background that you can use as a background piece, or a blender. That's another name for it. But what I usually do is I try to get a variety of tones. So I have some really darks and some really lights, and I have some mediums. So it just gives you more depth in your quilt, and the trick to doing quilts is to get your eye not to rest on one area, but your eye should move all over the quilt. So the more variety you have in your quilt, the more your eye is going to be drawn all over the quilt. Now, some people have said, I've talked to quilters who say they use a ton of different fabrics in their quilts. I mean, I usually stick to 8 or 9. Usually if I get more than that, I have a little more difficulty where to put it. So it's easier if you just stick with a certain number, probably less than 10. Usually when I design a quilt, it usually has less than 10 or less quilt fabrics in it.
I have to say one that I'm doing right now, that I'm designing has, I think, 5 colors, and that was a stretch. I had to like make myself pick that 5th one. But we have actually done a challenge quilt in the past. It was 3 or 4 ago now, excuse me, that had 24 different fabrics, but they were all from the same collection. So they were all sort of like subtle differences from one another, but they were all actually different. So, and I know when I saw that fabric requirement list, I was like, there's no way this is going to work, but it really did. So yes, sometimes you can get away with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so somebody asked, heavy quilts. When I was young, we used old blankets, but what would you suggest now for a heavy filler?
Oh, that's a good question. I have no idea. If you want a warm quilt, you don't need to make it heavy. You can use 100% cotton. Cotton will keep you warm. You could use, they now have silk battings. Silk is a good one that'll keep you warm. So as long as you use a natural fabric, you can get a wool batting that'll keep, anything that just keeps the heat in. So it doesn't have to be really heavy. Now I've seen heavy quilts that were made of, they use jeans, leftover jeans, or flannel quilts can get pretty heavy too. So you don't have to use a heavy batting in it just to make it warmer.
So if your intention was not necessarily the warmth, but the actual weight of it, what is the heaviest that way? Like what weighs the most? Which batting weighs the most?
That, you know what? I have no idea.
I don't
I
know
mean,
either.
wool batting is very light. It's probably lighter than cotton.
Mhm.
And, you know, I can't think of what would be a heavy batting because
Mhm.
most battings today aren't heavy. You know, I mean, they're very lightweight. Even 100% cotton is, and some of the thicker cottons aren't heavy.
Yeah, I agree. If your intention was the warmth, definitely Toby has answered that. If your intention was the weight of it, because you're thinking more along the lines of wanting to make sort of a weighted blanket or things like that, on our sister site, National Sewing Circle, I believe we have an article on there on how to actually make a weighted blanket. So that's like the one where you actually, you have the 2 layers of your blanket or your quilt, and then you're stitching either rows or blocks or something in it and actually filling it with almost like beanbag material or something like that to actually weight it down. So if that's the route that you're going for, we also have that resource that you can check out as well. Our next question here, what thread brand do you prefer on your long arm quilt machine?
Well, I use a fabric called Glide a lot. It's a polyester. It's called Trilobo polyester, and it's very fine. And it comes in a lot of different colors. The company's name is Fil Tech, FIL-Tech, and I don't like a real heavy thread when I'm quilting because I don't want my quilting to overcome my quilt. I mean, I want the design to show on my quilt. I also use Superior thread a lot. They're variegated. Some of their variegated polyesters are really good. Cotton tends to be too heavy for me for quilting, but a lot of people like to use cotton threads for quilt on their long arms. That's just not my choice.
So that's the thread fiber content. Do you have a preference on weight?
Yeah, usually it's about 50 weight, which means it's a kind of the weight terms are kind of confusing because the higher the number on weight, the thinner the thread. So if you have a 20 weight thread, it's a pretty thick thread. A 50 weight thread is kind of just in the middle. It's fine. You can go all the way up to a 100 weight thread, which is called lingerie thread, and it's very, very fine. So 50 weight is usually what I quilt with.
Do you quilt with the same thread that you piece with, or do you use something different for that?
For piecing, I use Alex Anderson's Masterpiece 100% Egyptian cotton. I really like that thread for piecing.
But the weight of that one?
The weight on that is a 50 weight too.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Do you ever use bobbin thread, like specific, if you go to the thread store, you have all your thread that you just talked about, but then you have another section that just is called bobbin thread. Do you ever use it, and what is it?
Okay, well, bobbin thread is just a very lightweight thread. Superior makes one. It's called I can't think of the name of it. It's called bobbin. Anyway, and it's very fine, and I've used that in the bobbin sometimes when I'm quilting, especially with invisible thread, because I quilt with invisible thread. So if you use the bobbin thread, it works real well with the invisible thread instead of using the invisible thread in the bobbin too. And it's just a real fine weight thread. Since it's fine weight, you get more on your bobbin, so it lasts longer.
Yes. When you're working with that invisible thread, because I've only ever used it a few times, and I feel like over the years it's kind of gotten better, I guess, if you want to say that. It used to feel like you were sewing with like fishing line, but does it still feel like that, or is it more thread-like nowadays?
Or the old invisible thread was made out of nylon, but the new invisible thread is polyester. So you can get it really, really fine. Superior makes a good one, and so does what's the French one?
Arfil?
What kind of thread? Yeah, Orifil makes a really nice invisible thread. And you can get them in clear and smoke. So if you're doing dark fabrics, you can use the smoke and it doesn't show up.
Speaking of all of those things, we actually have a video on National Quilter Circle where one of our instructors does show both those colors, the clear and the smoke of the invisible thread, and kind of does a little step-by-step of some things that can help you when you are sewing with it. One of the things that she suggests, which I don't know if this is something that you use or not, is like a thread sock that goes over your spool of thread when you actually put it on your machine. Is that something you've used?
Yes, I have, because a lot of times it'll get wound up underneath the spool. So these little, it's not really a sock. It's like what you find in your vegetable. Sometimes vegetables are in that. It's like a netting. So it goes around your, you got some.
I think I've got one. So there we go.
Yeah.
This one actually, yeah, came with my machine. But so it looks like if you stretch it all the way apart, it goes like that and just, yeah, fits down over your thread and just keeps it from.
Right.
Yeah. Perfect. See? So if you, we were just talking, actually, we had a live event last night for National Sewing Circle. We were also talking about accessories that come with your machine. And so if you have just gotten a new machine and maybe, you take it out of the box and you have just your regular presser foot on there, you've got your bobbin, you've got what you need to sew, and you kind of set this fun little bag of accessories aside and you forget about it, you should definitely go through there and sort of see what attachments and things come with your machine, because I feel like nowadays you get more things with your machine when you buy them. You get more specialty attachments. Do you find that, Toby, that you actually get more extra accessories nowadays than previous?
Yeah, I get a bag of things and I have no idea what to do with them. I have, the new machines come with so many things, and so many settings that, it'll take me a year to read through the book to figure out what to do. I mean, yesterday I was teaching a class and all of a sudden when I started sewing, it would backstitch when I started. And I thought, why is it doing this? And it's because I accidentally pushed a button that told me that said I should, that's what it did.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So I also have that button on my machine. It's called Fix, F-I-X, and if you hit that button, it will do a little back stitch or stitch on top of it, a little stay stitch kind of thing right on top of it, and you can either turn that on or turn that off. So I feel like machines are overly smart these days, and sometimes they think they know what you want them to do, and they just do it for you.
That's right.
Yes.
You push the wrong button, you could be doing something you didn't want to do.
It's true. It's true. So I do a lot of quilting and sewing. So when I am quilting, obviously I'm usually using a straight stitch and that's it. Piecing, quilting, just straight stitch. If I'm doing sewing, I have to be using a zigzag stitch. Do you ever change out your throat plate or your foot when you're doing quilting? So you have that straight stitch throat plate and straight stitch foot?
No, I don't.
No.
I didn't know there was such a thing as straight stitch foot.
Yeah.
No, but I've never used my single hole because I always, my 1/4 inch, I always use my needle moved all the way to the right. So I always have to have an open space on my throat plate.
That is true. I forgot that you do that. So explain how you set up your seam allowance.
Well, I just move my needle all the way to the right. I have a little ruler that I use that has a little 1/4 inch hole in it, and I put my needle in the hole, and then I put a little piece of mole foam pad, Dr. Scholl's mole foam pad, next to the ruler, and that's my 1/4 inch seam. That's what my guide is for my 1/4 inch seam. It just gives me a consistent 1/4 inch seam. I have a YouTube video that explains it. So if you put my name in, you'll find it.
And I think, did you do a video for us on that?
Yes, I did. I don't know when it's going to be on, but yeah, I did.
Soon. I'm going to go with soon. It will be up there. Because I know I have watched it, as in it's been edited, and I know it's getting ready to be up on the site. So I know it's coming soon. So I have never done that technique. So I always either use a 1/4 inch foot, or on my throat plate, I have the 1/4 inch line, or even actually on my, this is actually the bobbin cover. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it has the 1/4 inch line on there. So that's always what I've lined up off of. If you're someone who is worried or leery about sticking something onto your machine, does that leave a residue? Does it leave stickiness? Like if you were to take it off, is it going to be just fine?
No, it doesn't leave a residue at all. And if it did, you can take a little bit of alcohol and just rub it off. But I mean, consistency is the key. And and every sewing machine has a different 1/4-inch foot that are different. Some are the more than the other. So this way, when I use multiple machines, I can set them all up, and then they're all the same. Then if I go from one machine to the other, I know I'm going to have a consistent 1/4-inch each time.
So, but you have to do that every single time, moving your needle position every single time because when you turn your machine off, doesn't it automatically go back to the middle?
Yes, it does.
Okay, perfect. See, so as long as you remember to do it every single time, you're good.
Well, I mean, that's the only way I sew my 1/4-inch. So, I mean, it's ingrained in my brain, because that's what I do.
Fair enough. All right, so we talked earlier a little bit about the types of thread and weight and brands and all of that you like to use, but do you have a preference when it comes to needles? Because that is one thing that comes, in your handy little bag with your sewing machine is usually a couple different types of needles. But do you have a preference as to brand and or, size, type, any of that?
Yes, I do. One quilt teacher I had a long time ago said, don't ever use universal needles. And I can't remember why, but I use a Microtex sharp, I'm trying to needle, and I either use a 80 or a 90 usually, unless I'm doing really lightweight fabrics, then I'll use a 60. I mean a 70, but normally I use an 80 or a 90.
Are you one who changes a needle before every new project or after your 6 to 8 hours of sewing time that you've?
I'm guilty of that. No, I don't. I know you're supposed to. And you're supposed to clean out your bobbin every time too, change a bobbin. And you really should, because you wouldn't believe all the gunk that gets inside that bobbin case if you don't. And you'll know it's full because your stitches won't look right, because it gunks up your stitches.
So when you are cleaning out your bobbin in your bobbin case, do you have to take your machine apart? Like, what do you have to do to get into where you need to clean out?
No, you don't have to. Yeah, I mean, you just take out the bobbin case and you use I use a makeup brush, and I just brush around inside there. And don't ever blow. Use an air blower, because that puts moisture in your machines. They say don't ever do that. Now, you can do it on a long arm, because I do it on my long arm, but you shouldn't do it on your domestic machine. So you just use a brush or something soft to get in there to get all that lint out. And sometimes a Q-tip will do it too.
So in terms of how often you clean your machine, is how often you clean your long arm similar to how often you clean your conventional sewing machine?
No, I tend to clean my long arm more often, because the bobbin area is really big, so it shows up more when it's dirty. And it's right in front of you, so you can't miss it. Whereas with your regular sewing machine, it gets in underneath them, so you don't always see how bad it is until your stitches start skipping. So yeah, but you should clean it out at least after each project.
Perfect. All right. So speaking of your long arm machine, so again, since you are now our resident long arm expert that we get to talk to every month, if you are someone who wants to sort of get into using a long arm, playing around with it, what are some features of a long arm that you definitely should look for? What are some that are maybe just extras that if your machine has them, awesome, but maybe you don't necessarily need them?
Well, I think you really have to play with them. You have to go to a quilt show or something and play with the long arms to see what you're comfortable with. When I started, there weren't a whole lot of brands out there. There was Gamble, and then there was, I think, A1 at the time, and then there was, I can't think of the other brands. But anyway, but now, everybody's got a long arm. Even the regular domestic machines like Hough and Bernina, they have long arms. So, you just have to go to a quilt show and play with them and look at the features you want, look to see what you can afford. I mean, you could pay up to $35,000 for a long arm machine with the computer computer where you set the computer up and it does it for you. I mean, you can't leave it. You have to, you have to watch it, and you still have to set it up to the size of the block. And there's a lot of learning curve with the computerized ones. But, I mean, just there are some that I like better than others. And just because I played with them, and some people tell you they love this brand or that brand. It's just like a domestic machine. There are people that swear by this brand, and there's people that say, oh, I don't like that brand, I swear by, so it's just a matter of choice or taste.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of going to quilt shows, where are you going to be next? Are you going to a certain quilt show?
No, I'm not.
I thought you were. I was trying to set you up for it. I thought you were.
I usually go to Paducah, the AQS show in Paducah, the spring Paducah show. But this year, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to any quilt shows this year. That's kind of sad.
You're just gonna have to put one on your schedule now, because I asked you and now you have to come up with one.
I'll go to the fall Paducah show then.
Okay, deal. All right. Someone says, I made a round table center, and when I went to put the border around it, it curled up. Do you have any idea why?
Oh, well, if you put a border on it, if you didn't cut the border and the bias, you can't put a straight border on a curve. And so that's probably why it curled up. The same thing with the binding. If you're going to put a binding on a round quilt, you have to do a bias binding. So it would be, if your border's really big, it would be really hard to put a border on a round quilt. And that's normally why you don't see borders on round quilts, because you just have to leave it at that and bind it, like a Christmas tree skirt or something, that you don't see borders on those. So I don't know how you could fix it if it curled up, unless you made it smaller. It depends on how wide the border is. A wide border will not lay flat on a round quilt, even if you use a bias. Do it on
right.
You'd have to cut the border in a curve, the same curve did your quilt.
Yeah, and I guess you could do that, and unless you had, a big enough piece of fabric that you could set your table center down in the middle and like trace around it to get your border, you might just have to do, say, like little half moon sections at a time, going all the way around, and maybe that could work.
Yeah, that would be the best way to do it.
If you've already put your border on it and you don't want to take it off and you're trying to fix it, so I have my sewing side of my brain is thinking of ways to like fix this in a sewing manner, and my suggestion is going to be, so I'm actually working, this is off topic of quilting, but on a project where I'm sewing some skirts. And so in a skirt you can add what is called a goddet, so it's like this little triangular insert, but you could sort of do that on your border. So if your border was curling up, you could cut a slit and then put in a little triangle insert, and that would help it kind of lay flat going around that circle. So if you didn't want to do any ripping, but you want to get creative, like, this is my suggestion.
That's a suggestion.
Yeah, I think in my head, I think it'll work perfectly. But if you do this and try it and it works, you'll have to let us know that it actually did work or not.
Yeah, right.
All right. Speaking of that, speaking of not wanting to rip, what are some things in terms of a mistake that you can still fix versus when is a mistake something you just have to like scrap the entire quilt and start over?
Well, I've made mistakes, but I've never scrapped the entire quilt. My rule of thumb is if I have to rip, I rip 3 times. And if it still isn't right, but I'm a perfectionist when it comes to seams. If it still isn't right, it's never going to be right. And I just have to learn to live with it.
I like it. Speaking of you being a perfectionist with seams and of you doing some videos for us, which I get to watch and review before they go onto the site, I recently got to watch one of yours where you actually basted a seam first. And it kind of blew my mind because I've never heard of anyone basting and quilting. So will you explain what you did?
Well, usually if you're doing a star, an 8-point star or some kind of star, and you have a seam in the center, if you sew the whole thing and it didn't match in the center, then you got to rip the whole thing. So if you baste just the center, like 3 or 4 stitches just across the center, and you check it to see if it matches, And if it doesn't, then all you have to do is rip 3 or 4 stitches out instead of the whole thing. So it just makes it, and then you can redo it and get it till it matches. And once it matches, then you can sew over your basting stitch and just finish sewing that seam.
Yep, I thought that was pretty cool. I don't know, I'm not a fan of basting, but I might try it a couple times and see. In terms of just lining up your points, what are some other tips that you have for, aside from basting, just before you even get to the sewing or the stitching, for making sure that your points are lined up from the beginning?
Say that again.
What are some tips for making sure that your points are lined up just even before you get to the actual sewing? Like,
Oh, you mean, oh, okay. Usually what I do is you can either put a pin in through the center of both sides and do it that way, or I usually will just fold one side down like like I know where 1/4 of an inch is, and then I will check my seams that way. And once I get those lined up after I fold that little 1/4 inch down, then I put 2 pins, one on each side of the center seam to hold it, and then I do my little basting. So that's how I get it to match.
perfect. Do you treat lining up seams in terms of just like nesting a seam differently than you would if you're trying to line up, you know, points of, say, 2 flying geese are coming together?
Well, no, I mean, well, wait, if you're nesting your seams, you still have to check to see if they're matching. So you can still pull it down that little 1/4 of an inch. So yeah, no, I don't treat any different. I mean, I might pin it differently, but I still check to see if it matches before I pin it.
Okay, and then the other thing I noticed when I was watching your videos is you and I pin things exactly opposite. So I pin with the head of the pin out away from the fabric, and you do it the opposite way. Is there a reason why?
Yeah, because my little piece of mole foam is sitting right next to my foot, and I want to be able to sew as close to the pin as I can because I want to hold that part together. Say I want to match something like a design in the fabric. And so I want to sew as close to the pin as I can. And if I pin it the other way, the pin bumps into the mole foam.
That makes sense. I didn't think that one through. Makes sense. Do you have a preferred pin that you like to use?
Yes, I do. I like these. They're called patchwork pins. They're by Clover and they're 0.4 millimeters thick. They're very, very fine. They're great for batiks. If you use a lot of batiks, because they just slide into batiks really nice. Now I just recently saw a new pin. I'm going to have to. It has a nice big rubber head on it that's heat resistant, so you can grab them easier. So I'm going to have to check those out.
I have seen some of those. So I actually did a video a while ago now on like showing all the different kinds of pins, because you can go crazy getting like tons of different kinds of pins, from the size to the shape to the design. And I don't know if these are the same ones you're talking about, but they also had a really big rubber head on them. But they were meant more of to be like ergonomic, so they were easy to grab. So if you have a hard time, or like most times I have long fingernails and it can be kind of hard to try and grab that tiny little glass head pin. And so these were supposed to be much easier to grab. So I don't necessarily know that they were or not, but they might be for you. I don't know.
I'm gonna get some and I'm gonna try them out. Somebody at a workshop I was teaching had them, and they were really neat. And you can get them a real fine pin, the same thinness as the other ones that I use.
Perfect. All right, so someone asked, recently I did the mystery block with paper piecing. I loved doing it. Is there another one coming out soon?
Not right now, but you never know what's going to happen in the future.
Well, so there is one soon, as in like the next challenge is coming out though, but it is not paper piecing.
No, it's not. It's just regular blocks, and it's not a mystery, because we had some requests to have one that's not a mystery this time.
We did a poll on it, and we were asking if you wanted a mystery or not a mystery. And I really thought after the last couple being a mystery that we were going to have like a blowout, absolutely no mystery, like, that's what everyone was going to say. And it actually was pretty close. Like the percentage wise, the fact that it's not a mystery only won out by like the tiniest of margins. So there is still quite a few people out there who do enjoy the mystery aspect of the quilts. So. But if you are somebody who wanted the mystery because they were afraid that when they saw the quilt, it was going to look too intimidating. So I think we had that comment with the previous one, the ice crystals challenge, is people said, oh, I'm glad I didn't see this because I would have thought it was beyond my skill level or too hard for me. So if you're thinking that when you see this new one, how do you sort of overcome that, or just do it anyway, knowing that you're going to be able to, kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think after that last medallion challenge, a lot of people said that they were pushed, beyond what they usually do. And so, I mean, I think if you're looking for a challenge, which is what we're doing to you guys, is we're challenging you to try something new. If you look at it and you take it, break it down into smaller sections, I think it isn't quite as overwhelming as when you look at the whole quilt. So if you look at the individual blocks and you go, oh, those aren't so hard, I think it'll make it a little easier to think about when you do that.
Absolutely. And just like with all the other challenges, we will have videos that go along with the challenge. So I'll do some live videos, and you'll be doing your blog again as well, correct?
Yes, I'll be doing my blog.
Perfect. So there will be plenty of resources if you need any help along the way putting this together. Since we have said that it's going to be not a mystery, so you're going to get to see it ahead of time. We know now that the blocks are going to finish at 8 inches because we already sort of gave that away. You did say that there was not as many flying geese, but are there any other, say, standard quilt block units that are recognizable that are going to be in this quilt? If you want to hint at some design here.
Well, there's a chevron part to a block. A chevron is just kind of the opposite of a flying geese, where both angles are going in the same direction, like a parallelogram. So that's in one of the blocks. And I do love triangles, so I have to admit there's quite a few triangles. I mean, if you just had squares and rectangles, the quilt would be boring. So there are quite a few triangles. And those who don't have AccuQuilt and don't have the 8-inch cube, we will be giving directions for both cutting and which dies to use if you do have the 8-inch cube.
Yes. Speaking of triangles, because I know this is something that you and I talked about a while ago now, but how there's a time and a place to use a half square triangle and a time and a place for a quarter square triangle. And I think some people don't necessarily know that there actually is a difference to the two of them as to where you put them and why.
Right. And the difference is a half square triangle has 2 right angles. So you take a square, you cut it in half, one diagonal line. So you have 2 edges that are on a straight grain. And those usually go in the corner of your quilts or the corner of your blocks. And then a quarter square triangle is a square cut into 4 triangles, and it has a 1 long straight grain. So that one is one that's usually used on the outside of like a setting triangle or a flying geese, because you want that outside edge on a straight grain. You always want your quilt or your block to be stabilized, and you always want the outside of it to be on the straight grain. You can't always have that way, but you try as much as you can to do that.
So when you're working with the triangles of either which one, and you're actually, attaching the bias edge of that triangle to, whatever piece is being attached to, do you have tips for making sure that you don't distort that or overstretch it or ruin it in any way?
Right. And usually what I do is I'll pin the beginning and I'll pin at the end, and you just let your machine do the work. I mean, your machine's not going to stretch it. It only stretches if you hang on to it while it's sewing, or pull it while it's sewing. So if you just let your machine do the work, it's not going to distort. That's why most people are afraid of triangles. They think that they're going to get distorted. And as long as you let your machine do its work, that it doesn't get distorted.
Perfect. Speaking of letting your machine do the work, we're going to go back to like how we're talking about the your long arm machine, which is free motion quilting most of the time, correct?
Right.
If you're getting into that and you're used to your machine doing the work, how is it different, or how do you practice the fact that with free motion quilting, you are doing the work, your machine's not, evenly pulling a stitch, you're the one that has to do that. So how do you do that?
Well, I mean, when you're doing quilting, you're either moving the quilt or you're moving the machine. Well, you're moving the machine on a long arm, so you're treating your machine like a pencil or pen, and it's your stylus. It's what you're doing to make your design. When you're moving the quilt, it's a little hard. Well, for me, it's a little harder to move the quilt because I just can't get that. I mean, some people can get a smooth and beautiful designs with their regular machine, and it just depends on what kind of coordination you have, I guess. I don't know. But with the long arm machine, based, like I said, it's doodling. If you can draw it, but people say if you can draw it, you can do it on your domestic machine too. So it's just a matter of practice. I think if I sat down and I practiced on my regular machine doing quilting, free motion quilting, I would get better at it. But it's something that you have to want to do.
Mhm.
I want to get better at my long arm, so I do practice that. But with the domestic machine, I don't practice it because I
You
can
don't
do
want to.
I can do miniatures on my long arm machine, so it doesn't make any difference.
So your long arm has a stitch regulator though, right? So you don't.
It does have a stitch regulator, but I don't always use it because my first machine, I had a machine before the one I have now, and I had no stitch regulator on it. So I was the stitch regulator. And you get into a rhythm where you get all your stitches even. So, and I happen to like not using the stitch regulator more when I'm doing free motion stuff. I use the stitch regulator mainly when I'm doing quilt in the ditch because I do want my stitches even when I'm quilting in the ditch. But other than that, I don't always use the regulator.
Do you ever use rulers or templates like when you're actually doing your quilting as sort of a guide for quilting?
Yeah, I've used templates. I have a whole bunch of templates I've never even tried because I keep thinking I'm going to use them. But, I use a template when I want to stitch in the ditch because it has a little 1/4-inch guide on it to keep my stitch along the ditch of the quilt. So I have some that have curves on them, and I've used those. And I've had some that do like a vine, if you're doing feathers and stuff, I have some for that. So I have used templates. I don't use them as much as I could, but because like I said, I'll look at something and I just start doodling, and it's easy. It goes faster if you doodle. Once you start using rulers, it just takes a little longer.
Mm-hmm. So I've done stitch in the ditch quilting. You mentioned that's what you do on your whole quilt first to go around the blocks. On my regular machine, and when I do that, I actually put on a stitch in the ditch foot. Are there other feet that you can put on a long arm, or is it just one standard and that is the only foot you can use?
I've never changed the foot. I know there is a micro quilting foot you can put on some long arms where you're doing the little bitty tiny stitches, but I've never changed. I don't even know if I can change the foot on my machine.
I didn't know either. I don't have really any practice with those, so I wasn't even sure if that was a possibility. So you're telling me your long arm doesn't come with a fun accessory bag?
No, it doesn't come with a fun accessory bag. Not like that.
Well, all right, fine. All right, so I want to talk more about long arm quilting just because we have a few more minutes here. So if anyone has any question that isn't related to what I'm going to ask you now about long arm quilting, go ahead and type that into the comment section and we can get a couple more in before we're done. But just because I am interested in long arm quilting because I think it would be really fun to learn, but it's definitely super intimidating. What is the first, rather than just a doodle, what is the first shape to practice, or what is the first sort of building block that you need to learn to be able to then get into doodling?
Okay. Well, I mean, the easiest thing to do is a meandering stitch, which is just, you're just moving your machine and you're just moving around, just making little not loops, but, and it's not a zigzag. It's a
meander.
Meander. Yeah. You're just and that's the easiest thing to do if you want to start with something like that. You can build up to different things there. You can do a hook, which is just a real simple, you make a little hook like this. And that's a lot of stitches start with that. So you can do a flower around it, or you can do a feather around it. So the hook is something that you can learn pretty easily. Another one that's real easy to do is called a shell stitch. or a scallop stitch, and you just keep making loops, and pulling them into each other, and you just keep adding them. So, I mean, you just have to start real simple and then build up. I was teaching a lady, she wanted to learn how to long arm, so I took her to my machine, and she thought she could learn to do it in a day. And I said, no, it's going to take some practice if you really want to do it. So yeah, it's just like anything else. You just got to practice it. I mean, I had my long arm machine for 10 years before you can either work in the back and do pantos, which are edge to edge designs that you put on your table, your quilting table, and you follow them with a laser light. You can do that. Or you can move to the front and you do free motion quilting. And for the first 10 years I used my long arm, I was afraid to move to the front. I was always doing, I was always doing pantos. So I took a bunch of classes at a long arm show, and after that, I wasn't afraid to move to the front of my machine anymore. So it does help to take classes to get you out of your rut sometimes.
Yeah. So with the panto, so can you decide what size you're gonna, project your little laser on there, or is it just you get what you get, you just have to follow the line?
Well, there's so many different pantos out there. You can get feather pantos, you can get flower pantos, you can get pantos with birds or, anything. I mean, I had one with cats and bears on. So you just put them on the table, and you roll out this long sheet that's 12 feet long, and you put it on your table, and then you just go from side to side on your quilting machine. Usually you go from, if you're in the back, you go from right to left because your machine works better that way instead of left to right. But you just do one, and then you move your fabric, you move your quilt, and you do the next row, and you just keep doing that. And it's an easy way, but I mean, that takes practice too, because it's really hard to follow that line with your light.
Yeah.
So you do have to practice that too, to be able to follow that line and get it on your quilt so it looks halfway decent.
Perfect. All right, last question about long arm quilting and just quilting in general, and then of the evening as well. But when it comes to starting and stopping your quilting, because I feel like this is something that maybe gets overlooked a little bit, because you figure with piecing, you never backstitch because your seams are always going to be, overlapped by the next by the next one. How do you knot off or make a knot backstitch? What do you do when you're starting and stopping your quilting, whether at the beginning or because your thread broke or you changed a bobbin or whatever?
Well, it depends on, I mean, there are some quilters who start off by leaving the thread. I mean, you do always pull the thread to the top when you're quilting, so you can grab both threads when you start. But some leave that and they don't make a knot or anything, and then they knot it. If it's a competition quilt, they knot it by hand and then bury those threads. But I mean, I'd be doing that forever if I did it with my quilt. So I just make a couple little tiny stitches, 4 or 5 little stitches right next to each other to start off. And then I sew, and then I do the same thing at the end. I make a couple, 4 or 5 little tiny stitches next to each other, and they hold the stitches together. They seldom come out. Most of my quilts are wall quilts anyway, so they don't get washed.
Oh, so even if you were going to wash it, you'd still be able to just do those on top of each other, clip those threads, say like flush with the top of the quilt, and be good?
Right.
Perfect. All right. Well, so now we know how to start and stop our quilting. We know how to practice our long arm quilting. So we should all be like professional Toby Lischko quilters in like a day, right? I think that's what this means.
No. Practice, practice, practice.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here to answer our quilting questions. We look forward to talking to you again next month. And of course, we'll have some more information coming up soon about the next challenge that should hopefully start sometime next month as well. So we will be seeing more of you soon.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Perfect. Have a good night, everyone.